In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how we see reality in a way that helps us survive.
Okay, so here's one of Binswanger's claims. I love this claim. It's such a cool idea, and I think there's neurological support for it, neuropsychological support. What we perceive are, first and foremost, not impressions of taste, tone, smell, or touch, not even things or objects, but meanings. Well, that's an interesting idea, because it's been said that every person is an unconscious exponent of some great philosopher's presuppositions. Well, mostly the way you think about the way you perceive is that there are objects in the world, you see the objects, you think about the objects, you evaluate the objects, you decide how to act on the objects, and then you act, right? It's from object, sense, perception, emotion, cognition, action. That's wrong. That isn't how it works. It's partly not the way it works because the way that you interact with the world exists at multiple levels. So for example, you have reflexes. So if I poke you hard, you'll react like that. You'll jerk back. And you do that without thinking. That's part of a neurological circuit that's very deeply embedded and that's virtually automatic. It's reflexive. It doesn't require conscious perception at all. It's too slow for starters. And so you have there's multiple levels of you interacting with the world. And at one level, you're seeing objects, you're thinking about them, you're planning what to do. But you're doing all sorts of other things that are way faster than that, and other things that are way slower at the same time. Now, what Binswanger claims is that what you see in the world are meanings. And so it's the meaning detection first and the object recognition second. Now that's a hell of a claim, that is. But there's definitely levels of your nervous system that operate in that manner. So for example, here's a good example. People have blind sight. Their visual cortex is damaged. They can't see objects, so they think they're blind. But if you show them an angry face, they'll manifest a change in their skin conductance. They'll orient. And it means that the eyes are still mapping the face onto the amygdala. And the amygdala is mapping the pattern onto the body. No object perception. Pattern, pattern, pattern. No object perception. And so the meaning is what's being perceived first and foremost. And you have to perceive meanings first because you actually want to stay alive. That's the trick. So the world is full of these things that have meanings to you that are relevant to your survival. And what you're perceiving first is the relevance of the pattern to your survival. And the idea that you can conceptualize that as a set of objects, well, first of all, that's a pretty new idea, technically speaking, right? Because technically speaking, we didn't really start to conceive the world as subject in an objective world until we really formalized science. Now, science was implicit long before it became explicit, but it didn't become explicit until about 500 years ago. So you react to meanings. So here's an example. Babies. If you have two surfaces and you put a piece of glass between them, they're elevated, and you put an 8-month-old baby on the one surface, so they can crawl, the baby can crawl, it won't crawl across the space. And you might say, well, it sees a hole and won't crawl across it. But that isn't what it sees. It sees a place to fall off. That's direct perception. So when I see this, for example, my eyes see that as a pattern. That pattern's on my retina. It's propagated through my optic nerve. It's propagated into my brain. It's propagated onto my motor cortex. And the propagation is that. Right? So I can pick it up. And when I look at that, this is implicit. That's implicit in the perception. You think, well, why do you see that at the size and resolution you see it at? That's why. So the fact that you see it that way has this implicit in it. It isn't that you see the object and match your hand to it. It's that matching your hand to it is part of the perception of the object. It's what gives the object meaning. And so you perceive the meaning of the object. It's part of the perception. And you can't not see the meaning of the object. Well, you can. If you're a scientist, you can sort of separate out the object from its meaning. That's actually what science does. It tears the object away from its meaning. And then, of course, there's nothing meaningful left, and so science ends up value-free. But that's because the meaning has been torn out of it. Now, there's technical reasons for doing that. But Binswanger's point is, don't kid yourself. You see the meaning first. Here's an example. You watch the trade towers fall. What did you see? Well, you could say, well, you saw the towers fall. It's like, why are you in shock for 2 days afterwards then? Well, because the towers aren't, what are the towers? Exactly. As long as they're standing and operating, they're towers. As soon as they fall, God only knows what they are. Maybe they're the beginning of the next war. You know, who knows what they are? And so everyone was in shock for 3 days because what they saw was the indeterminate meaning of that event. And it opened all sorts of gateways. It's like, well, the towers fell, there's gateways open everywhere. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know where we are. And that's direct perception mapped onto your body. Bang, you're in shock. You see the meaning first. And well, you constrain it down to, well, why are you so upset? Well, the towers fell. It's like, that's the best you can do for a verbal utterance. It's what your perceptual systems reported to you, but God only knows what happened. We still don't really know what it meant that they fell. Now, most things have put themselves back together, but... And then you think, well, what does it mean? What does it mean that what you see first is the meaning? And that's a really tricky question, because you might say, well, that's when you get back to the problem of what constitutes real. So I could say, well, you've evolved to see the meaning. Well, then we might ask, well, if you've evolved to see the meaning and that's kept you alive, is there anything more real than the meaning? Because somebody who's a materialist would say, well, no, the object is more real. It's like, no, it depends on how you define real. It might be that the most real thing about the visual cliff is that that's a falling off place, and that its secondary description as a, an object, a hole or something like that, that's just that's something you paint over top of the primary reality. And so, well, here's a practical application of it, or at least one of the things that I think is practical. You can have experiences that differ in their, let's call it, high quality meaning. So you get engaged and engrossed in something and you're happy about that. It's not that you're happy, it's that you're engaged and engrossed in it. You would do it again, even though it might take effort. You can tell that where you are is meaningful. Well, I think what happens in that situation is that you're in a Piagetian place where many of the games that you're playing are stacked sort of isomorphically on top of one another, and the experience of meaning is the fact that you're playing the small game properly, nested inside a larger game, you're playing it properly, nested inside a larger game, you're playing it properly too, etc., all the way out. Past is balanced, future is balanced, everything is stacked up. And there's a report coming from your being telling you that, that's why you're engaged. You might say, well, maybe that's real. Maybe it's more real than anything else. It's a strange thing, because if you think that meaning is separate and secondary from the real objective world, then the reality is the object. But it isn't obvious that the reality is the object. It's certainly not how we act. It's not how we perceive. And so, did we evolve to perceive reality? It depends on what you mean by perceive. Perceive might mean, did we evolve mechanisms that allowed us to survive in the face of that reality? Yes. Is that what's real? What enables you to survive in the face of reality? It's a definition. It's a perfectly reasonable definition unless you can come up with a better one. Meanings are primary.